chat. God, how long has it been since I've, like, streamed 2 days in a row? I mean, I think I did that a couple weeks ago, to be fair, but you get my point. It's been a while. Oh, wait, my water bottle is not right next to me. 1 second. So, today I hung out with some friends, and we went to this, like, shopping center kind of thing. It wasn't really like a mall. It was like a mall, but not. And they had a candy store there. And okay, I'm not normally one that drinks energy drinks because, too much caffeine makes me anxious. But they had a shelf of, an assortment of energy drinks. And one of them said something along the lines of Shadow the Hedgehog, speed, whatever. And you know, I had to have it. I had to have it. So, I did. I still feel a little bit, like, of the effects of caffeine. I haven't really been too anxious since it happened, but, I mean, there was one thing that I kind of got a bit paranoid about, but resolved quickly. So, and along with the fact that I had, like, 2 different things of candy, I still have Smarties in my pocket. I bought like a bunch of candy because we went to an arcade before, and I basically everything that I got from the points that I like got from different arcade games. I got like 2 things of Smarties, a box of Gummy Jolly Ranchers, and a box of Gummy Starburst. It was like Starburst Air or something like that. And also a little plushie. It's like a mouse, I think. Some kind of rodent, and I named him Wigington. After Jeff Wigington from Water Parks. Don't question my knowledge. Not my knowledge, my logic. That's the word. Logic doesn't always equal knowledge, kids. Keep that in mind. Maybe I should have caffeine more often if I want to be funny on stream. Well, anyway. This stream is not about my caffeinated ramblings. We're going to be reading chapter 22 of The Stars and Their Children. Such a good story. I love it so much. And I will be eating my Smarties while we read, because I forgot that they were in my pocket. And now that I know they exist, I have to eat them. Where is the window capture? Here it is. Boom. Oh, that is bright. Jesus Christ. I wish there was a dark mode for AO3. Or maybe there is. Hold on. 1 second. There is a dark mode for AO3. I want to have it. My dashboard, maybe? Preferences. No. Is there no settings for AO3? What? Wait, oh, customize. Low vision default? What the hell? Wait, what's a skin? AO3 is so confusing if you don't know what the fuck you're doing. Why the fuck is, what the fuck is Homestuck skin? I don't know. Okay, hold on. Let me look something up. Does AO3 have dark mode? Can AO3 be dark mode? Wait, if you want the permanent dark mode, scroll to the bottom of the Versi page and click the use button? Huh. Wait. The bottom of the Reversi page? What the fuck is the Reversi page? Sorry, I want to figure this out. Oh, it's a skin. Okay. Oh, this is so much better. My eyes don't feel like they're burning anymore. Oh, that is beautiful. That is so much better on my eyes. Where is it? Here it is, window capture. There we go. The text is kind of bright, though. You see, I just can't win. Yeah, it isn't. See, I just can't win. Either the background is too bright or the text is too bright. But when it comes to, like, majority, I'd rather the majority of the screen be dark than the majority of the screen be bright. If it gets to be too much, I will turn it back into, I will reverse the skin back to its original thing. But this seems good at the moment. Okay, let's see. Stars and the Children, once again, by Bones and the Bees. Be sure to check out the rest of her works. I might read more after this one, because she's a fantastic writer. Chapter 22. A desire to trust is not trust. Summary. Wilbur finds himself in a new kind of purgatory. Let's see. No trigger warnings, so that's good. It didn't take long for Wilbur to develop a new routine. In the mornings, he would take his breakfast in the dining room, and almost every morning, Phil would be there as well. Sometimes they'd spend the morning chatting about random things, like the latest book Wilbur had been reading, or the kinds of food they had available on Zephyr's 4 this time of year. It turns out, nearly everything they ate had to be imported onto the planet, so their options were somewhat limited. Other times, if Wilbur woke up with that unbearable ache in his chest, making itself more known than ever, he would simply stay quiet. And Phil was getting better at picking up on those days when Wilbur wasn't ready to talk in the morning. So once he figured out what was going on, he would either let them eat in silence without complaint, or he would fill the air between them by reading from some old Elytrian text he already had loaded onto his holopad. After breakfast, Phil would disappear to do his work, leaving Wilbur to fill his day however he pleased. Usually, this consisted of him wandering around the personal wing for an hour or so before going back to his room to read as a way to pass the time. He started inviting Jack into his room after a certain point, and the two would go back and forth trading stories, albeit with Jack sharing far more stories from his time as a guard instead of Wilbur talking about his life on Eldingvegr. Sometimes, Wilbur took the risk and left the personal wing to wander around the main part of the palace. Jack would walk ahead of him, looking around corners and listening intently for any familiar voices echoing down the hall. Thankfully, there were no more unexpected run-ins, although he and Jack were careful not to linger by the training room if they could help it. Wilbur did bump into Technoblade a few times in the personal wing. They always kept their conversation short and cordial. When it came to dinner, Wilbur would always have Jack ask the guards who exactly was in the dining room before they walked over. If Technoblade was sharing a meal with Phil, then Wilbur would just ask to take dinner in his room. Maybe it was cowardly to avoid even eating a meal with the Imperator, but it was difficult for him to look at Technoblade and not think of Tommy. In total fairness, though, nearly everything reminded him of Tommy these days. Still, he had no desire to put himself through a painfully awkward meal if he didn't have to, so he continued to avoid the Imperator all the same. Days passed like this. Also, wait, let me know if the music is too loud or if I'm too quiet. I think the levels should be fine, but I just want to make sure. Where was I? Still, he had no desire to put himself through a painfully awkward meal if he didn't have to, so he continued to avoid the Imperator all the same. Days passed like this. The routine was calming. That's what he told himself when he woke up in the middle of the night with a sharp gasp, adrenaline coursing through his limbs as the crawl space in the playroom flashed behind his eyes. That's what he told himself when he wandered through the halls with exhaustion weighing down his bones, Tommy's voice echoing through his ears as he commanded the Assempi soldiers to remove Wilbur's gag. That's what he told himself when he heard explosions flashing in his memories, watching the Silverwood trees burn as he and Tommy ran through the halls of the palace they'd grown up in. The nightmares were getting worse. When Wilbur woke up in the dead of night, body seized with fear as he heard Dream tell Aerith his intentions to kill both him and Tommy, he always threw a hand out to his left, searching the other side of the bed for the other body that should have been there. When his hand was only met with empty air, another jolt of fear would run through him. Then, he'd have to count his breaths while reminding himself that Tommy was staying in his own room now. He was safe. They both were. He just wasn't with Wilbur. It was easier said than done. More often than not, if Wilbur woke from a nightmare, he wasn't able to fall back asleep at all. He'd spend those nights staring at the glittering canopy above his head, sleep-muddled thoughts blurring between past and present. It was cold. That was the only thing Wilbur could think of as he wandered the palace halls, the marble floor stinging against his bare feet. Outside the windows, Wilbur could see dusty pink skies stretching out for miles on end, while the silverwood trees swayed in the faint breeze. The scream of metal ripping off of metal echoed in his ears. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it out, But the sound was in his head and not outside. There was no blocking it out. Half asleep, Wilbur didn't think about where he was going. He just let his feet carry him through the palace, heart pounding in his chest and cheeks sticky with dried tears. Soon, he found himself outside a familiar door, one he hadn't meant to go to, but his subconscious had led him to anyway. He wasn't sure why he was here. It wasn't like there was anything she could do to help him. Nights like these were always sleepless. It was a familiar routine to Wilbur at this point. He shouldn't wake her up. He'd only known Nikki for a few months, and even though he already considered her his favorite person in the palace besides Tommy, he didn't want to bug her if she was sleeping. Wilbur turned to walk away, but couldn't bring himself to. He needed to talk to someone, to get out of his own head so he'd stop hearing that screeching metal. But it was already hard enough to get Tommy down to sleep, and despite how much he loved to talk, at 4 years old, half of what he said was gibberish anyway, so it wasn't like he'd be very helpful right now. Nikki was nice. One of the nicest people he'd ever met. Maybe she wouldn't be mad if he woke her up. Just this once. Taking a shaky breath, Wilbur held up a hand and knocked on her door. Silence followed. Wilbur waited, shifting from foot to foot as the cold marble continued to sting at the bottom of his feet. Then, "Hello?" Nikki mumbled as the door slid open. She'd clearly been asleep. Her pink hair was frizzy, and her eyes were half shut as she held onto the doorway like she was going to fall over. "Oh, I'm sorry. You were..." Wilbur winced, guilt surging through him when he saw how tired she obviously was. "Never mind. I'll go." "Wilbur?" Nikki blinked, her eyes opening wider. "Is it morning already?" Wilbur shook his head. No, it's not." Nikki's brows furrowed. "Is something wrong?" Taking a step back, he shook his head again. "It's stupid. I didn't... Sorry, you can go back to sleep." Unfortunately, Wilbur's words seemed to have the opposite effect. Nikki's eyes widened further, and the haze of sleep dissipated as she looked him up and down, before her gaze settled back on his face. "Are you okay?" And Wilbur hesitated, because Nikki didn't seem mad. She didn't even look annoyed. When Wilbur was silent, something like realization washed over Nikki's face. "Can you not sleep?" It's kind of stupid," Wilbur said, brushing his hair out of his face. "I just had a bad dream, and usually I could go back to sleep, but tonight I couldn't, and I was walking around, and..." Wilbur was cut off by Nikki reaching out and wrapping her hand around his wrist. Then, before he could ask what she was doing, he was being dragged into her room with the doors swinging shut behind him. Darkness enveloped the room as soon as the light from the hall disappeared. The walls were dotted with silver and blue from both their freckles, and Wilbur watched the glowing dots move between the shadows as Nikki dragged him to her bed. "I can help you if you want," Nikki explained as she let go of his wrist to crawl under the blankets, scooting over to make room for him beside her. "But you can't tell anyone if I do. I could get in a lot of trouble for it with the ambassadors." Wilbur frowned as he settled himself under the blankets, turning on his side so he could face her. "How?" Nikki's eyes glowed a soft shade of silver, and thanks to the light from his own freckles, he could just barely make out her smile. "I'm not very good at it yet. But when I was little, if I couldn't sleep, then my mum would use her voice to help me. Oh. You can use your voice? Wilbur whispered, his eyes blown wide. It had been ages since he'd heard a siren use her voice. He could remember the way his mother's voice echoed off the walls when she'd tell him to breathe if he was hyperventilating, like he did when he cried too much. How the command was gentle, but would thrum through his bones all the same, and he would finally be able to take a full breath for the first time in minutes. He thought back to lessons whispered in the dark, his mother telling him what pitch to use, how to push the voice out from his throat and give power to the words he put in the air. She always reminded him that only a few people could know she was teaching him those things. How people would get mad if they found out she wanted him to use his voice like she did hers. I only started lessons recently, Nikki confessed, so it probably won't be more than a suggestion, but it might help you sleep if you want. Although Wilbur's eyes burnt with the thought of his mum, he was also exhausted and wanted to sleep. If Nikki could use her voice to silence the screeching metal echoing in his head, he needed that. Desperately. Please, Wilbur whispered. I keep hearing it in my head, and it hurts, Nikki. It hurts my head and it hurts my chest. Nikki frowned, clearly confused as to what he was talking about. But instead of asking about it, after a moment, her frown cleared, and she nodded. Okay, I'll see what I can do. She shut her eyes, her breathing steadying as the seconds passed. Wilbur wondered if she was doing the same exercises his mom taught him, counting the waves until they calmed. A few moments passed, then Nikki's eyes opened again. Go to sleep, she whispered. There was no echo in her words, and disappointment flashed through Wilbur when he didn't feel any compulsion to do what she said. Embarrassment flashed over Nikki's face at her failure. I told you I wasn't very good at it. Oh no. He didn't want to make her feel bad when she was trying to help him. It's okay. It's really hard to do that stuff, Wilbur reassured her. If you can't do it, that's okay. I'll be fine. Nikki furrowed her brows and shook her head. No, I'm gonna do it. Just give me a second. She paused again, and this time there was nearly a minute of silence as she ran through the breathing exercises in her head. Wilbur waited. Then, go to sleep. Although it was nowhere near as loud or echoey as his mother's voice had been, there was a soft echo to Nikki's words as the command thrummed through Wilbur's bones. What Nikki had said was true. It was more of a suggestion than a command. Wilbur's heartbeat began to slow, and he felt his eyes grow heavy, but if he wanted, he could fight it off. He didn't want to, though. Instead, he leaned into the suggestion, letting it fill up his mind as Nikki's voice tugged at the darkness edging his mind. Thank you, Nikki, Wilbur whispered, the screeching metal finally going silent as he let his eyes slip shut. There was the sound of shifting as Nikki resettled herself beside him. You're welcome, Will. Sleep well. You too. Nikki wasn't around to help him fall asleep anymore. She wasn't around at all, and neither was Tommy. It was only him in his room, and his resulting exhaustion was choking him. He hated the routine he was stuck in. While there was nothing wrong with it, it felt like he was suspended in purgatory, waiting for something to happen, something to jolt him into action. something to appear that he could strive for, a goal. He was wandering the hallways with no direction in mind, but that was what he desperately needed more than anything. A guide telling him where to go now. A map showing him what his new destination needed to be. Wilbur really needed to learn to be careful what he wished for. Nearly a week since he'd seen Tommy outside the training room, Wilbur's usual wandering hours were interrupted by Jack grabbing his earpiece with a deep frown. Yes? He asked, his voice cutting through the silence Wilbur had been suffocating in. Wilbur paused his steps, waiting for Jack to speak to whoever was on the other end. Really? Jack then asked, frown deepening. Right now? A pause. Fuck. Okay, look at him over there right now. With that, Jack let go of the earpiece and straightened up, something grim settling over his face as he met Wilbur's eyes again. You've been summoned to the conference room. Oh. The conference room, also known as the negotiations room. The room he hadn't sat in for ages now, because the negotiations with Phil and Technoblade had been put on hold. Wilbur was being summoned there. Not an invitation, an order. Shit, Wilbur breathed, a rock dropping into his gut. Do you know what it's about? Jack shook his head. No, wouldn't tell me shit. Just said you were being summoned immediately. That could mean a lot of things. Maybe Phil just wanted to talk to him again, but then that begged the question of why he was in the negotiations room. It's possible he could have already been in there discussing negotiations with some leader over a call, and simply didn't want to leave. Maybe whatever he wanted to talk to Wilbur about had nothing to do with negotiations of any kind. Maybe he was just... No. Wilbur couldn't lie to himself like that. There was something going on, and he wasn't going to find out what it was until he stepped into that room. Swallowing the dread crawling up his throat, Wilbur nodded at Jack, and Jack led him out of the personal wing. He kept his head down as they walked to the negotiations room, jumping at any sudden sound out of fear that he might turn a corner and run directly into Tommy. His heart was already pounding a mile a minute in his chest. Running into him was the last thing he needed right now. The walk to the negotiations room was far too short for Wilbur's liking. Nausea was twisting his stomach, and the waves were echoing in his mind as he fought to take deep breaths. When they came face to face with the other guards standing near the door, Jack flashed Wilbur a sympathetic look, before being forced to step back. One second, I thought I heard a Discord notification, but that might have just been the song. Yeah, I think it was just the song. Hold on. Eating a Smartie. Wilbur stared at the smooth metal door, trying to shove down the buzzing in his chest. There was no sense in panicking before he even knew what he was here for. Unfortunately, his anxiety didn't really listen to that logic, but he reminded himself of it anyway. Curling his hands into fists at his sides, Wilbur nodded at one of the guards, and stepped through the doors as soon as they'd hissed open. As suspected, Phil was in the negotiations room. He sat furthest from the door, his wings tucked behind his back and circlet resting perfectly on top of his head. When his eyes met Wilbur's, he didn't smile, and instead let his gaze flicker over to another occupied chair in the room. Wilbur followed Phil's gaze, and had to suppress the urge to flinch the second he saw who it was. Tommy looked just as alarmed as Wilbur was. His eyes were blown wide. His mouth was set in a thin line. When their gazes locked, Tommy blinked, like he had to force himself not to look away. And it was only then that Wilbur noticed the last person at the table. Technoblade was seated directly opposite of Phil. Unlike Phil, whose gaze was nervously darting between Wilbur and Tommy, Technoblade was staring at one thing and one thing only: Wilbur. It was like Wilbur had been punched in the face. His eyes stung, and his heart was pounding so loudly he could barely hear anything above it. The waves had turned tumultuous once more, and Wilbur watched them crash and rumble above his head, not missing how his lungs were starting to ache for air. What is this? Wilbur choked out, forcing his eyes back over to Phil. Come on, Orpheus, you know what this is. Technoblade replied instead, looking the most relaxed out of everyone at the table. It's been too long. We need to reopen the negotiations. No. This was too fast. Wilbur hadn't been prepared for this. Fuck, he hadn't even been thinking about when the negotiations were going to start again. He was stupid. So unbelievably stupid. His gaze flickered to Tommy again. His shoulders were hunched, and there was a crease between his brows as he looked down at the table. He was tense. That much was obvious. But there was something else, too. A twist to his mouth, the way his jaw was set. He was annoyed. Tommy was annoyed right now, and Wilbur didn't know if it was at the situation or personally at him. Had he asked for Wilbur to be here, or had Phil and Technoblade insisted he be summoned as well? Wilbur doubted it was the former, given how Tommy could barely even stand to look at him. So if it was the latter... His thoughts were spinning with unbridled panic. The waves were roaring in his ears, and his legs were turning to jello beneath him. He thought back to the last time he had heard Tommy's voice, the icy rage sitting behind his words, and then he thought of his own response, falling back into the one thing he knew how to do. I was under the impression that Prince Theseus didn't need my advice anymore. Wilbur forced out, his word as flat as could be as he slipped into court speak. Unlike all the times he'd gone to say Tommy's name before and stopped himself, this time there was no hesitation when he said Tommy's title. When he fell back on his etiquette training, it made it so much easier to fall into using Tommy's formal name and title as well. It was what he was supposed to do in a situation like this, after all. Wilbur couldn't deny the flicker of satisfaction saying Tommy's formal name brought him, though. The way Tommy flinched at it, like Wilbur had slapped him across the face. The past week apart from Tommy had subdued his anger, but the waves were starting to build once more. He could hear Tommy's insult echoing in his ears, and Wilbur found it all too easy to indulge in his own pettiness in return. Meanwhile, Phil and Technoblade both frowned at Wilbur's words. Are you saying you don't wish to act as his advisor? Phil asked, wings rustling. I never said that, Wilbur shot back, now not daring to look away from Tommy. Prince Theseus has just made it clear to me he doesn't need my input on negotiations, so I don't... Oh, shut the fuck up! Tommy suddenly shouted, cutting Wilbur off. His face was twisted into a scowl now, and his shoulders were shaking as he straightened up in his chair. A million emotions flashed across his face as he met Wilbur's eyes. And once again, Wilbur was struck with the realization that he didn't have the slightest clue what Tommy was thinking. "I don't understand," Wilbur said, surprised at how calm he sounded despite the maelstrom raging inside him. "I thought you didn't want my advice." A beat of hesitation. "Your Highness?" It was a cruel barb to throw into a genuine sentence, but Wilbur couldn't hold himself back. And of course, it had exactly the intended effect. Tommy's scowl deepened, the icy fire in his eyes sparking again. "First off, don't call me that. Second off, I didn't ask for you to be here. They did," he hissed, pointing between Phil and Technoblade. This time, it was Wilbur's turn to flinch, because he figured Tommy likely hadn't wanted him to come to this kind of a meeting, but the confirmation was another stab to his chest nonetheless. "Fine," Wilbur snapped back, glancing over at Phil. "Can I leave then? As you can see, His Highness doesn't want me to act as his advisor." "I just fucking said to not call me Theseus." "Wait, no, Theseus," Phil said, his voice surprisingly low as he cut Tommy off. "I understand you don't want Orpheus acting as your advisor. Right now, he's the only person from Eldingvega on the entire planet. Intergalactic law requires that you must have the option of an advisor with you to discuss formal negotiations. If you're a minor, they must remain present even if you opt out. Of course, you don't have to listen to what he says, but Orpheus needs to remain here." Then, Phil looked over at Wilbur. "I'm sure you're aware of that rule as well, Orpheus." It was both a reminder and a light scolding Phil knew only Wilbur would understand. Of course he knew that Tommy needed an advisor for negotiations, but he'd gone and asked if he could leave because, frankly, he didn't want to be here for this. He had no desire to listen to Tommy sign away their home planet out of spite or whatever it was that was twisting his face right now. Even from across the room, Wilbur could feel sparks of anger bouncing off of Tommy. He had no desire to let himself get burnt again, not when the gaping hole in his chest was still dripping blood onto the stone floor below. But he didn't have a choice. He had to stay here, even though it was already getting difficult for him to breathe. Gritting his teeth, Wilbur forced himself to walk over to Phil's side of the table. He sat as far from Tommy as he could, trying not to squirm under Tommy's scrutiny as he glanced between Wilbur and Phil. "All right, now that that's settled," Technoblade cut in, resting his elbows on the table in front of him. "Let's stop wasting time and get started. Theseus, we've been talking about this a little bit on our own, so what are your thoughts now about Eldingvega joining the Empire?" Despite his cold demeanor, Wilbur was panicking on the inside. He had no idea what Tommy was going to say, because the last time they'd spoken about this, Tommy had wanted to join the Empire. He'd made it clear he didn't see any other options, and Wilbur had fought against that. Technically speaking, Tommy could sign the papers right here and now. Everything he'd been fighting for could be turned to dust in 2 seconds flat. And while Wilbur understood the logic of why Tommy was pushing for this, the idea of losing Eldingvega was sending him into a spiral. Tommy hesitated before responding. I'm still thinking things over," he admitted, eyes flickering over to Wilbur for half a second before focusing on the table again. "This isn't me, signing anything, got it? I'm just open to talking about how things might work if we're going to do this." "And that's perfectly reasonable," Phil agreed, nodding once as he folded his hands in front of him. "If we come to an agreement, a far more detailed treaty will be drawn up. But until then, to give you a brief overview, if Eldingvega were to join the Antarctic Empire, you could expect to maintain your position as Crown Prince and eventual King of the planet. Of course, certain decisions couldn't be made without consulting us first, especially in regards to Blazophane export and your military. Wilbur nearly had to bite his tongue to keep himself from speaking up at that. As much as he wanted to, he was determined not to jump in, because Tommy didn't want him as an advisor anymore, so he doubted he'd listen to anything Wilbur had to say anyway. If Tommy didn't think to question the details like Wilbur was, that was his own fault. At least, that's what Wilbur kept telling himself. But it was far more difficult to keep quiet than he expected it to be. Okay, we've talked a shit ton about the Blazophane trade before. Would you guys be taking full control of our exports if we joined? Tommy asked. And Wilbur dug his nails into his palm. Not full control per se, Technoblade explained, leaning back in his seat. We'd draw up a plan, pretty much. One that had a list of planets that a certain amount of Blazophane had to be exported to every month, and how much the planets would pay for it. Obviously, those planets would be ones under the rule of the Antarctic Empire, like Zephys 4 and the Nether. When it came to planets not under Antarctic rule or not allied with us, then we'd agree on a baseline price for how much to sell to them based on current market value and all that, and we'd meet regularly to see if it needed to be updated. There was a question burning in Wilbur's mind, because while that didn't sound like that terrible of an idea on the surface, there was so much more to that needed to be discussed. But he knew that's what Tommy was going to be expecting of him. For him to jump in so it could give him an excuse to get pissed at Wilbur. No, he wasn't going to hand that to Tommy. A beat passed in silence. Tommy stared at the table, his shoulders shaking as he took a long breath. Blue met brown, and Wilbur... his eyes flickered up. Blue met brown, and Wilbur tensed, because he could tell Tommy didn't know where to go from here. He was completely lost, and although he was trying to hide it, there was something pleading behind the icy flames. A cry for help. Wilbur forced himself to meet Tommy's gaze, and didn't say a word as he straightened up in his chair. A few seconds ticked by. Phil seemed to notice the stare-down going on between the two boys, as he glanced between them a few times before sighing and leaning back in his chair. Orpheus, Phil then said, his wings rustling again, I'd also like to hear your thoughts on this proposal, but you're not required to. If you wish to just observe, that's fine too. Tommy narrowed his eyes at this, while Wilbur stiffened in his seat. It wasn't an order. Phil was giving him a choice. A way to bring up his worries without actually giving advice to Tommy. It was almost annoying how well-crafted the move was. And as much as Wilbur wanted to hold up his petty streak and keep quiet, he knew he was going to drive himself nuts if he didn't say something. And Phil was giving him the perfect opportunity to do it. Well, I admit, there is one question a proposal like that brings up in my head, Wilbur began, choosing his words carefully as he fiddled with the cuffs of his sleeves. The thing is, Blazophane is not an unlimited resource. You want Eldingvega to provide a specified amount of Blazophane at a discounted rate to the members and allies of the Antarctic Empire, and then sell the rest at standard prices to the rest of the galaxy. But the Antarctic Empire isn't small. If Eldingvega sells the majority of its monthly yield to the Antarctic Empire at a discounted rate, then that's potentially a huge monetary loss for the planet, one it might not be able to withstand. Something warm flashed over Phil's face at this, and he nodded slowly, considering Wilbur's words while Tommy shifted uncomfortably across from him. That's a fair point. I can assure you you will keep in mind how much Blazophane is available before deciding how much you'll be selling to us for the month. If the yield is lower than we expected, we'll adjust accordingly so that you're still making a fair profit from the rest of your exports. A few months before, Wilbur would have immediately dismissed Phil's words as bullshit, because no one would pass up an opportunity to take as much Blazophane as they wanted. No one in their right mind, at least. But now, Wilbur found his certainty fading. Because while Phil was certainly in his right mind, he also wasn't a fool. Disrupting the Blazophane trade would have disastrous consequences for the rest of the galaxy. He'd even criticized Dream for doing exactly that since Asempi had taken over Eldingvegger. Phil had always been honest with Wilbur, ever since he arrived on Zephys 4. That was one of the ways he promised he was different from the other leaders. And so far, he'd done nothing to contradict that. For the first time, Wilbur found himself considering that maybe, just maybe, Phil wasn't lying. And although he should have been wondering if he was falling for Phil's manipulation, or if he was simply losing his own objectiveness because of how much closer he'd gotten with Phil as of late, he didn't. Wilbur didn't know if he could trust Phil, but he wanted to. And more than anything else, that scared him. Thank you for your insight, Orpheus, Phil then said, startling Wilbur out of his thoughts. You're welcome, Phil, Wilbur said quietly, dipping his head as he settled back in his seat. Suddenly, there was a scoff across the table. You're seriously calling him Phil, but you won't call me Tommy anymore? Tommy asked, his voice echoing off the walls. Right, okay, I see how it is. The waves began to swell, and even beneath the surface, Wilbur could feel them picking up and carrying him along with their destruction. Isn't this what you wanted, Your Highness? Wilbur retorted, raising an eyebrow at Tommy. After all, I am just a bastard child, as you kindly reminded me. I have no claim to Eldingvegger like you do, so why should I call you by your personal name and advise you during negotiations for a planet that isn't mine? Tommy winced, but didn't back down. Instead, his anger only seemed to grow as he placed his hands on the table. So this was your backup plan, then? Tommy asked, gesturing to Phil, to go and fucking join the other side the minute you had a reason to. I didn't join the other side, Wilbur defended, his voice cracking as he pushed to his feet. Really? Because you're wearing their colours and staying in the goddamn Emperor's private wing of the palace, so that sure as fuck looks like you picked a side to me. Tommy snarled, also jumping to his feet. Wilbur blinked, glancing down at the coat he'd already grown used to after several days of wearing it. Now that he was looking, he noticed that the embroidered star clusters that trailed down the sleeves and side of the coat bore a striking resemblance to the type of embroidery decorating Phil's cloak and Technoblade's coat. He thought back to how after he'd told Quackity he was staying in the personal wing, his good eye had trailed over the coat again, as if only seeing it for the first time. In his haste that first morning after the fight, Wilbur hadn't thought twice about wearing the new coat. But also, Wilbur wasn't clueless. Even in his haze, even if he hadn't been consciously thinking about the implications of the coat, a part of him had known what it represented. Up until now, though, no one had pointed it out to him, so he didn't acknowledge it. Now it was being thrown in his face in a way he couldn't ignore. He wanted to trust Phil, but he wasn't blind to what he was doing. To the message he was sending to everyone about Wilbur's position in the palace. But right now, Wilbur didn't want to focus on that, because there was so much there that he couldn't even begin to think about. The waves were roaring as they carried him along with their rage, and he wasn't fighting to breathe this time. The water had filled his lungs long ago, and all he could do was surrender to the suffocation. "You should be happy, Theseus," Wilbur hissed, storming around the table so he and Tommy were eye to eye. "Isn't it better to not have to deal with me anymore? My paranoia? My anger? I know you told Rambu all about how insufferable I was to be around. You got what you wanted. You don't have to deal with me anymore." At this, Tommy's scowl twisted into something so full of rage, Wilbur wasn't even sure if there was a word that could properly capture it. "For the love of fuck, get over yourself!" Tommy shouted, reaching out like he was going to shove Wilbur, but stopping at the last minute. He hesitated, and for a brief moment, the rage in his eyes was replaced with something so pained it hurt Wilbur's chest just to look at. "You turned your back on me!" he then exclaimed, his voice cracking as he stumbled back. And Wilbur wished he could have said something else. He wished he could have taken a moment to actually see the anguish playing across his little brother's face and acknowledge it for what it was. Instead, though, the waves roared in his ears, and Wilbur found himself shouting, "You turned your back on me first!" Because that's what Tommy had done, right? Instead of two brothers, two equals, Tommy had pointed out the truth they had silently agreed to never say out loud. That even if he was older and more educated than Tommy, Wilbur was always going to be beneath him. Tommy had power over Wilbur, and there was nothing either one of them could do about it. Before Tommy could respond, there was a flash of pink behind him, and Wilbur watched as Technoblade dragged him back. At the same time, there was a warm hand on his own shoulder, and Wilbur stumbled as Phil tugged him away. "I think things have gotten a little too out of hand," Phil said, guiding Wilbur around the opposite side of the table from Tommy. "Yep, I think you both need some time to cool off," Technoblade agreed, squeezing Tommy's shoulder. "We're not going to get anywhere in the negotiations like this." Wilbur flushed with embarrassment, because as much as he wanted to say it was all Tommy's fault for instigating things, he knew full well that wasn't true. Neither one of them had held their tempers like they should have, and regret was already curling around Wilbur's chest as he met Tommy's gaze across the room. The fire had died out in Tommy's eyes. All that was left was pure, crushing exhaustion. They wore matching dark circles under their eyes, but the tiredness wasn't just physical. It was something deeper. Something that went down to their very bones. Brothers. Or something that had once been like it. With that, Phil pulled Wilbur out of the negotiations room, and Wilbur didn't fight it. Once outside, Wilbur noticed Jack... One second. Sorry about that, my dad came in the room. Let's see, where was I? Once outside, Wilbur noticed Jack stiffen up when he spotted them both. But Phil held a hand up to him, gesturing for him to stay as he led Wilbur down the hall and away from the room. Once they were a fair distance from the doors, Phil stopped walking, his wings brushing against the floor before he pulled them tighter against his back and turned to face Wilbur. "Orpheus, don't," Wilbur said, cutting Phil off before he could start. "I know what you're going to say. That was immature of me. I fucked up. I should have handled myself better. I fucking get it, okay? Although the waves were no longer carrying him in their currents, salt water was still burning in his throat, and his jaw hurt from how tightly he'd been clenching it. His anger had calmed for now, but now he was left with the hollow aftershock of it all, like the ruins left behind after a flood. The tense expression on Phil's face immediately softened, and he let out a quiet sigh, squeezing the hand he still had resting on his shoulder. Well, you could have handled yourself better. Better. I think Techno and I are both also partially to blame here, Phil said, glancing at the ground. This was too abrupt. Neither of you had been told you would be negotiating again today, or even warned that you would be seeing the other. That was unfair of us both, and it won't happen again. Oh. Phil wasn't blaming him? Yeah, that... Wilbur's breathing hitched, a lump forming in his throat when he realized that despite what a fucking mess that was, Phil wasn't mad at him. That wasn't very fair. Phil's brows pinched, and he shifted his hand from Wilbur's shoulder to the back of his neck. You know, before we, had to end things, I wanted to tell you that you did really well in there, Phil told him, his voice low. Your question about the blazophane yield was smart. You point out a flaw in my logic that didn't come off as hostile, but was a real issue that needed to be addressed. Despite how miserable he was feeling overall, Wilbur couldn't help the warmth that flooded through him at the praise. It seemed obvious to me, he murmured, dipping his head as he took a breath to steady himself. But thank you, Phil. Things like that aren't obvious to everyone, Phil pointed out, rubbing small circles into the back of his neck. Your mind is made for these kinds of discussions. You understand how others twist words to hide their true meaning, which is an invaluable skill to have in politics. Cheeks burning, Wilbur shook his head, avoiding Phil's eyes. You don't need to blow smoke up my arse to try and make me feel better. I'm not just saying shit. I mean it. You have so much potential, little bird. Wilbur was blinking fast now, but not because he was upset. In fact, it was quite the opposite. The praise was simple, but it sounded so unbelievably genuine. At that, Wilbur thought back to his realization inside the negotiations room, that he wanted to trust Phil. Could he trust that Phil was telling him the truth here? That he truly thought that Wilbur had potential? He didn't know. But in this moment, with the gaping wound in his chest having been ripped open from where it had barely begun to heal, he decided that wanting to trust him was good enough, at least for now. Wilbur didn't think about hugging Phil. All he could think was that he was still so tired from the argument, and everything inside of him ached so badly. The next thing he knew, he was stepping forward and wrapping his arms around the man. He buried his face in Phil's shoulder, and Phil stiffened, clearly surprised by the sudden contact. But before Wilbur could even think about pulling away, there was the sound of rustling, and the wings wrapped around him once again. Phil hugged him back, and for a moment, just a moment, nothing hurt. None of it mattered. Not Tommy, not Eldeberger, not anyone else inside the palace. For a moment, he could just breathe. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, and Wilbur jolted away on instinct. Phil did the same, his wings quickly retreating to be tucked behind his back as he took a step away from Wilbur. Wilbur glanced over his shoulder as soon as the mystery person turned the corner and came into view. He wasn't sure if he should be relieved or annoyed when he saw it was Rambo, because while there were certainly worse people it could have been, Rambo wasn't anywhere near the top of his list for people he was okay with seeing. "Oh, hi Phil," Rambo waved, pausing for a moment at the end of the hallway before continuing to walk towards them. "Hi Orpheus." "Hello, Rambo," Phil greeted, dipping his head. "What are you doing over here?" Phil blinked, shrinking back like he always did when Wilbur's gaze landed on him. Techno sent me over. He said he wants to talk to you when you're done talking to Orpheus." Phil looked back at Wilbur, something conflicted flashing through his eyes before shaking himself off. "Oh, yes. We were just finishing up, right, Orpheus?" Wilbur nodded, hoping Rambo couldn't tell how emotional he'd been only a few minutes before. "Yup, just finishing up." "Good. I should probably go talk to Techno. Wait, no. Good. I should probably go talk to Techno then," Phil said, walking around Rambo to head back up the hallway the way he came. "Thank you for letting me know, Rambo. And Orpheus, have one of the guards call me if you need anything else." And with that, Phil disappeared around the corner, leaving Wilbur completely alone with Rambo. For a beat, the two of them stared at each other. Wilbur thought back to when he'd heard Rambo speaking about him with Amesy, how he'd pointed out that Wilbur didn't ask to get put in the personal wing. Although Rambo was quick to make judgments, he seemed to also genuinely want to understand Wilbur's side of things. At least that's the impression he got from all the questions Rambo tried to ask him before. The last time the two had properly spoken, Wilbur had been on the edge of a full breakdown. He'd been cruel for the sake of needing a punching bag to take his frustration out on. "I thought we could be friends too, Orpheus. That's how I know you're a liar, because we were never anything close to friends." His own words echoing in his mind almost made him wince. Although he didn't think he was necessarily wrong, Wilbur knew he'd gone too far with how he handled that. Of course, he hadn't exactly been in his right mind when he said those things, but shame bubbled up inside of him nonetheless at the reminder. He took a breath. Rambo was shifting from foot to foot, like he wasn't sure if he should leave or not. "I was a dick to you the last time I saw you," Wilbur said, figuring there was no point in beating around the bush. Rambo furrowed his brows. I mean, you were upset. I get that." Wilbur shook his head. "No, it wasn't right of me to take that out on you. You were kind of just at the wrong place at the wrong time." He paused, eyes falling to the floor. "I'm sorry about that." There was a beat of silence. Then, "It's okay." Glancing up, Wilbur saw Rambo was giving him a small smile, and a tiny bit of guilt lifted itself off his shoulders. "Really?" "Yeah, of course, man." Rambo nodded, letting out his own breath of relief. "You were dealing with some stuff, so I get it, but I appreciate the apology." Although Wilbur didn't smile back, he nodded. I'm glad." A moment passed. Wilbur wondered if this was his cue to leave. But then, Rambo spoke again. "Hey, how are you doing, though?" Rambo asked, giving him a worried look. "I heard about the, argument you had with Tommy, and Techno told me you guys were reopening negotiations today. So, did those go okay?" And there it was again. The nagging in the back of his mind. A little voice telling him that he couldn't trust Rambo. That Rambo was too nosy for his own good. that it was strange for him to jump right into asking about the negotiations as soon as they had smoothed things over. But Wilbur did his best to shove that voice as far away as he could. Because he'd stopped trusting everyone around him, and look where he ended up. He still wasn't sure if he could trust Phil, but he wanted to. And while he didn't have any more confidence in Rambu either, Amesy was right when they pointed out that Wilbur had never given Rambu a chance to earn his trust. Wilbur was exhausted. Exhausted because of Tommy, exhausted because of his situation, exhausted because of the constant paranoia he'd been living with for the past several months. He wanted to try something else, so maybe he could start by having a normal conversation with Rambu. They didn't go great, Wilbur answered honestly, twisting his fingers into the fabric of his coat pockets and ignoring his discomfort at admitting this so openly. Tommy and I got into an argument, so Phil and Technoblade had to cut it short and separate us. Rambu blinked. Oh. A pause. Then, in a surprisingly soft voice, "Are you okay, Orpheus?" Wilbur thought back to the sensation of warm wings wrapped around his back, and how starkly it contrasted with the cold that ran through him when Tommy had met his eyes. "No," Wilbur admitted, shaking his head. "Not right now." Even though things weren't okay, there was a certain measure of relief that came with admitting it. He wasn't okay, but there was no one around him telling him he had to be okay. And that in itself was another weight off his shoulders. I'm so normal right now. Oh my god. Phil and Wilbur hugged. Sorry, I'm just. Oh dear Lord Jesus up in heaven. That was so good. I'm just. I love this fic. All right. I think we are going to end it here. That felt like such a short chapter in comparison to the others, but I don't know. And I did make plans with my brother and my dad to watch the first Avatar movie, because we're going to watch the other one in theaters tomorrow. The other one, the sequel. I mean. In the meantime, let's see if there's anyone we can raid. Hold on. Wait. I forgot that I closed out of Twitch with Quackity's stream up. They're still streaming. They've been streaming for 3 fucking hours. Oh, Quackity's drunk. That's awesome. Anyway, but I know who we can read. Let's raid, Beetle. Yeah. Beetle is streaming Minecraft. Really cool person. You should go support them. I forgot the pronouns. I feel bad. But yeah. Thank you so much for watching. Probably not gonna be live tomorrow. But we'll see. Alright. Bye.